to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Ahrens, and today I'd like to address an issue which comes up in performance, but perhaps doesn't get the depth of thought that it requires. When we perform, we are in control of everything that the audience hears, and hopefully we present a composer's music in a way that the composer themselves would be happy to hear it. When we put our own individual stamp on the interpretation, we modify elements such as rubato, sound color, and phrase and inflection. The piece is what is on the page, but the performance includes little alterations that are personal to us in terms of what we want to communicate. The limits of the freedom of what to add to a piece changes from person to person, and some performers prefer sticking to the score, and other performers prefer treating the score as a starting point. One area of artistic addition, which I think deserves some serious discussion, and is rather unique to pianists, is the addition of low notes. What do I mean by this? Let's consider the middle section from Chopin's Third Scherzo. A lovely chorale tune with sparkle in between. Now, this is all fine so far, but the very next bars have an interesting situation in the left hand. The right hand has a tune that resets the chorale. The left hand in octaves follows this tune precisely except for one note. The B-flat octave is nowhere to be found, even though it is surrounded by other octaves. This sounds rather odd on the piano, because there's a dropout in sound in the middle of the phrase that cannot be tied to any musical or gestural reason. If you want to play it as written, you almost have to hide or obscure the lack of a bass note by making all the other bass notes sound a little less. In other words, you're de-emphasizing the bass notes so that one that is missing is not missed. Now, when we encounter this kind of situation, the first instinct we should have is to ask ourselves, does this happen anywhere else in the piece? Well, let's take a look. The second time this issue happens is in the bars 236 to 243, where the phrase is similar to the first time, only with a different ending. Notice that the low B-flat is still missing. The final time we encounter this phrase and texture is in bars 486 to 493. Notice how the left hand plays all the octaves here. Full octaves versus nearly full octaves. What's the deal? This is where a little knowledge about earlier instruments makes a huge difference. First of all, this piece was written in 1839, and pianos from that era tended to be built with C being the lowest note. There were many instrument building traditions at this time, and they differed due to region. French pianos, like the Erards, were different than Viennese pianos like the Bösendorfers, which were in turn different than English-style pianos like Broadwoods. All played very differently to each other, all used different actions and frame constructions, and they all produced very different sounds. All that being said, the lowest notes available on all of these manufacturers was C, and this note corresponds to the lowest C that we have on the modern piano. As a minor note, there are extant Streicher pianos that have the range down to the low A as early as 1846, but considering that the Scherzo was written 7 years before, it's reasonable to assume that Chopin was working under the assumption that the C was the lowest note most commonly found on pianos of the time. It really wasn't until the mid-1840s to early 1850s when manufacturers en masse offered keyboards that ranged to the bottom A, and sometimes below that. So, that answers our question about why Chopin omits the low B flat. He simply didn't have it, and he assumed no one else did. This leads to a logical solution which many pianists proceed with. Simply add the low B flat to make the phrase texture complete. So, our first example illustrates perhaps the best situation you can find yourself in if you wish to add a low note. Chopin didn't have the low B flat on his pianos, and in a similar musical passage, he shows that the texture should be uniform. So it makes logical sense to add the low note. In other words, it's pretty cut and dry here, and very little of this decision relies upon our feelings or sonic desires. Now we're going to jump into the realm of adding low notes because we feel like it. This is where the discussion becomes very personal, and where, for what it's worth, there is not nearly enough serious discourse about the choices some pianists make. From now on, and for clarity's sake, I'll say this. My concern in the upcoming examples is not with judging if a choice is definitively right or wrong. It's about identifying arguments for and against, and it's up to you to decide if you want to do something or not. The earliest composer which suffers alteration is Beethoven. It's understandable because of what we know historically. He was always using the limits of the instruments he had, and he would push those limits frequently. In his Sonata of Opus 57, we can find a situation where some pianists have added a low octave to what would normally be a single low note. As written by Beethoven, we have this. The long build-up to the dominant chord is structurally very important because it sets up the whole coda of the first movement. When he finally hits the low C, it seems like a turning point of stability has been reached. This is where some pianists have made the choice to add the low octave. To increase the feeling of arrival on the dominant, the extra low C adds weight and resonance. purely sonic perspective. It just sounds cool. Unfortunately, there are problems with this approach. Beethoven didn't have a low C at all. And in fact, the instruments of the time usually went down only to F. The instinctive argument, based on what we know of Beethoven's character, could be that Beethoven would have used the low C if he had it. I'm not sure if this holds water. First, there is no similar section that we can compare this to in order to see if Beethoven was forced to change his texture or register due to instrument limitations. Secondly, there are many examples where Beethoven writes the low C resolving downwards to the low F. We have it in the opening phrase. We have it in the recapitulation of the second theme. In fact, I would argue that all of the important cadences of dominant to tonic in the first movement rely on the left hand moving downwards. C going down to F. The only examples of him going from the C up to the F is within long phrases, like in the recapitulation here. In other words, the low F, in addition to being the outermost physical limit, is also the outermost musical limit in the left hand. By adding in the low C octave at a preemptive structural climax of the piece, we end up subverting the power of the real climax that follows using the low F. Think about it. Beethoven's original has this gesture expanding outwards. If we add the low C, then the resolution to the F sounds less powerful. This is a classic case where the addition of the low bass disrupts the gestural pattern that was set up earlier in the piece. I like to hypothesize that if the low C was available to Beethoven on pianos of the time, then he would simply have written the piece in C minor and not F minor, still using the dominant to tonic drop as a universal symbol in the piece. However, this is not a particularly strong hypothesis. It's just an educated guess based on what we have. Still, we're left in the uncomfortable realm of adding notes because we like the sound of it. This is a dangerous precedent because this allows us to open the door to altering other things as well. Though I am averse to slippery slope fallacies, we do run into the problem of justification. If the reasoning behind changing the score reduces to, I like the way it sounds, then what parameters can we use to prevent the same justification from being used elsewhere? We can use it to say, I'll play it slower than the metronome marking because I feel like it, which is not too bad. But if we say, I'll change the notes in this chord because I think it sounds better, then I think we have a problem on our hands. If we keep on doing this, then it becomes less of Andrew playing Beethoven and more of Andrew playing Andrew's version of Beethoven, which, in my view, is a no-no, unless that is the advertised intention, as in, I'm going to play Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata as arranged by Andrew Ahrens. By changing what is written, we're throwing out the thought and struggle behind the original choices the composer made. And if we do it on the cavalier basis of how we feel, which is in many ways the antithesis of thought and debate, then it's doubly sad. But what of the proposition that is frequently used as a justification, that if the composer had the opportunity to include these low notes, then they would have for sure? Is there any support for this position at all? Well, consider this. Much to the vexation of many pianists, quite often we will find a note in the music of Ravel that appears to hint at the availability of a lower note that is no longer available to us. Our first example comes from Jeux, in the middle of the piece. Look at the left hand here in bar 48. After a long glissando downwards, we have a G sharp. Then a G sharp an octave below, and then the lowest note on the piano, an A. Harmonically, this A doesn't work at all with the broken chord that follows. A low G sharp would be much better. Now, hold that thought. In the third piece in the collection Miroir, he hints at the same thing. The octave pattern is pretty clear in the bars after, but bar 93 has one problem. The lowest note is an A, which does not coincide with the upper G sharps. Earlier in the same piece in bar 44, we find what is perhaps the correct reading. A printed low G sharp. We don't have a low G sharp on the modern piano. What in the world is happening here? Usually, the first concern is regarding misprints or errors in the text. This happens more often than one would think, and even modern editions today still suffer occasional mistakes. But this issue of a low A that doesn't match harmonically, and an occasional appearance of a low G sharp, which we cannot play today, is consistent enough to warrant further investigation. This question comes up frequently with Ravel, and the answer is always a little off the mark. So I'm going to clear it up now. Ravel had studied in his youth at the Paris Conservatoire, and the official piano maker for the Conservatoire at the time was Erard Pianos. During this period in the late 19th century, Erard produced extra-large concert models, which had 90 keys instead of the modern 88. The extra 2 keys were the low G sharp and the low G. As a student, Ravel would have known about this piano model, and probably have performed on one of these instruments in a piano competition, a recital, or even at an audition. When writing his piano works later on in life, I have no doubt that he had in mind the availability of these lower notes. I've played on an extra-large concert grand model Erard from 1877, and given that Ravel studied at the Conservatoire in the 1890s, surely these pianos had been around for a decade at least before Ravel's time as a student. These were not brand new inventions, and were probably standard for many of the concert halls in France. The lower compass notes were not available on any other model Erard, and the only other manufacturer that had extra low notes was Bösendorfer. Their imperial grand piano has been manufactured since 1892, initially as a commission by the composer and pianist Ferruccio Busoni, who at the time required the low C for his transcription of Bach's organ Passacaglia in C minor. These 2 instruments, the extra-large Erard and the imperial Bösendorfer, were the only regularly produced pianos that had these low notes at the time that Ravel was writing. Now is where I must speculate. Music publishers are well aware, sometimes to a fault, of what kinds of music people are predisposed to buying. Beethoven had suffered his sonatas being sold as separate movements due to the perceived difficulty in playing certain movements. There are many alternate editions of Schubert, where his music is transposed into easier keys to play in. The third impromptu of Opus 90 comes to mind, being transposed into the easier key of G major instead of the original G flat major, and so on and so forth. I would not be surprised if the editors at the publishing house Durand were concerned about the availability of the low notes in Ravel. Very few people had regular access to concert grand pianos, and furthermore, even fewer would have had one in their home. My guess is that Ravel was asked to change the low G sharps in his scores to A in order to make the pieces universally playable. This solution has problems. The opening of Scarbo from Gaspard de la Nuit offers us 3 notes: F double sharp, G sharp, and D sharp. When we return in bar 395, Ravel offers the same notes, but with a fake octave on the first 2. Because of a lack of a low G sharp, Ravel moves the lower voice up a semitone for the first 2 to maintain the intervallic relation, assuming that the pitch is so low that no one will hear the difference. Given the situation, this makes sense. The lowest notes on the piano are usually so distorted in terms of partial recognition that the string sound itself is determined by the pattern of what higher partials are ringing, rather than the strength of the fundamental. If the higher partials are encouraged by the false octave being played above, then it can fool the ear to an extent. It's only when we have a direct comparison that we notice just how far out the solution really is. Here are correct octaves. Now, here are the accommodated octaves. In Scarbo, this situation is exposed to the audience very clearly. And to be honest, when I performed this work years ago, I was trying to determine what kind of solution would help the ear better. Eventually, I came to a solution which also seems to work in Jeux. You have to add a note and voice the chord in a special way. When we are trying to hear low pitches on the piano, we rely on the upper partials of the sound field to identify the fundamental. It's a backwards process compared with hearing notes in the moderate and upper ranges. If you have a note like C, it will consist of the fundamental pitch and partials that ring on top of it. We'll have the fundamental, and above will be the octave, then the fifth, then the octave again, then the major third, the fifth again, and the seventh, and smaller intervals into infinity. This is known as the harmonic series, and these upper partials can be coaxed into sounding by the lower fundamental. If I hold down the first few partials and strike the fundamental loudly enough, we'll get a residual sound of the partials. Now, what happens if the note is too low for us to hear the fundamental? Well, when we're dealing with low pitches, we're essentially taking the relative strengths of the partials above and extrapolating from them what the low fundamental actually is, even if we can't hear it clearly. We're listening to these in order to determine this. This is almost a mandatory requirement on the piano, because the low strings have a lot of distortion that comes from the mandatory increase of mass to the string, which is required to compensate for the fact that they're too short for their pitch, even on concert grands. What this means is that when we want to have the illusion of a low G sharp, it's not enough just to shorten the octave and play an A with the upper G sharp. By doing so, we get a lot of distortion because the two notes and their partials are fighting to be heard and in some ways becoming a kind of white noise. Even if we voice the two notes so that the upper G sharp is clear and crisp and the lower A is just fuzzy, it still sounds wrong. We actually have to introduce other notes to encourage or increase the vibrations of the partials that would be consistent with a low G sharp. So, in other words, we need to play a D sharp, which is the fifth. This is the most noticeable partial aside from the octave, so it has to be here if we want to fool the ear into thinking that this is a true octave and not a fakery. In terms of voicing, the top voice should be the loudest, the fifth very soft, and the bottom voice the softest. The idea being here is that the top voice establishes the pitch, the fifth reinforces the pitch, and the bottom provides the growl. If we need to, then we simply compare the true octave A with the artificial octave G sharp in order to get the sound as close as possible. It'll never be perfect, but with distance in a concert hall, the audience will be more inclined to hear a G sharp octave rather than just a mess. When we try it in Jeux, the situation happens so fast that the audience will be wondering if the piano tuner modified the low A to be a G sharp. See what I mean? In this case, we're adding notes to attempt to recreate what we think the composer was originally going for. And this relates to the earlier proposition that if the composer had this note available, they'd definitely use it. But there's an important thing to consider here. We have enough clues in Ravel's scores to lead us to this conclusion with reasonable certainty. The pianos he had available in concert halls had the low notes. The harmonic situation calls for those low notes, but modern pianos, aside from one manufacturer, do not provide them. Thus, we add notes in order to create the impression of what we're missing. This is very different to adding low notes because we enjoy the extra resonance, or because it provides a dramatic effect. This is almost like fixing a situation that is slightly broken. I'd like us to consider one more example which confronts the issue of adding low notes. In Rachmaninoff's third concerto, there's a place in the beginning of the first movement that suffers the addition of the lowest note on the piano. As written, we have this. As many modern performances and recordings display, the last note is extended to the bottom A to create this. While it's an interesting effect, there isn't any reason to do this, and there are quite a number of reasons not to do this. The first one is the most obvious, and should be held as the highest form of evidence. Rachmaninoff uses the lowest A in the concerto, in parts of the cadenza, and in other movements. So we know from the score that he had access to this note, and would use it when he thought it was appropriate in the piece. That should close the argument. But that's not the end of the story. We have a recording of Rachmaninoff performing this concerto in late 1939 and early 1940. He makes substantial changes, mainly in terms of shortening the piece at strategic structural points, but he also adds this low A, contrary to his own score. So, we have a situation now where if we only knew of the score, then we'd only play what is written. But having this recording of the composer adding his own low notes means that we're almost given license to do the same, at least in this particular place. If Rachmaninoff thinks it's okay, then it's probably okay. But I do still wonder why he never changed or edited his score to accommodate this change. Is this something he did in the spur of the moment? Is it something he practiced and prepared? What was the cause? I have no idea. What makes it even more difficult to consider is that if he was still alive for us to ask the same question, what in the world would we do if his response turned out to be, well, I felt like adding that bass note? We have to remember that vectors of interpretation like tempo, rubato, sound quality, and dynamics are only left open to interpretation precisely because the composer chose to leave them open to us. Composers have the choice of restricting certain elements, and many contemporary music composers constrict as many elements as possible to the point where a good performance of their work involves absolute precision rather than human interpretation. But the point is, the freedom we have in some interpretation elements does not necessarily translate to freedom in other areas that are specified. The idea is non-transferable. For the most part, we cannot change the written notes, and adding low notes specifically changes the resonance of the instrument in a way that is noticeable, but perhaps not in the way we'd think instinctually. When we add low notes, we're adding an element that, when compared to other parts of the piece, increases the sense of emptiness of higher resonance. In other words, if we add low notes, we'd probably have to start adding high notes as well to balance everything out. This begins the slippery slope. Well, is there a procedure I'd recommend? If I wanted to add a low note, here's what I would ask of myself. First, did the composer have the note or not? If they had the note, but chose not to use it, then we probably shouldn't do so either. If they didn't have it, then we move on to the next step, considering other possibilities. Does the low note interfere compositionally with structure, voicing, timbre, gesture, perception of range, and balance? Or is the low note being added to fix a problem, or to enhance the intent of the composer? Finally, is the change worth it? You have to balance those issues out for yourself, and be prepared for criticism from others if you choose to change the score. In Bach, we'll freely add ornaments, because that was the performance tradition at the time. In Chopin, we'll freely use rubato, flexing the perception of time. Once again, a performance tradition. But low notes require a very different problem-solving approach. As long as you think about it and properly research your choice, then you'll be on good grounding for your final performance. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and remember, whatever you choose to do, make sure your reason to change the score can be supported. Bye for now.